So yes, they should be recording their sessions, and you should be able to have access to it after spring training is over.
Perfect, thank you.
You bet. Thanks for asking, and thanks for reminding me.
No problem.
I would have gotten in trouble. Everybody who's just joining us, we're just waiting a minute or so just to give other folks some time to come in. I know the last time I did one of these, people all went to the wrong link. So it took them a little while to get to the right place. So there might be some of that going on as well. Oh, wow. Mary, thank you for joining us from DC. I can't wait to hear about your trip to the museum. Thanks for being here. Yeah, I bet. Yeah. All right, well, it's a little bit past 6, and we have a lot of material to cover. So I will just get us started. Let's start with some prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we praise you, we bless you, we give you thanks for this day. Give you thanks for the gift of community and opportunities to serve you and serve your people and to serve your church. We ask you to make your presence known in this time, that we might be drawn closer to you. Keep us always watching for you, following you, and holding you and your love for this world ever before us. All this we ask in the name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, welcome. And again, thank you. It is such a great gift that you are all here sacrificing a sunny Tuesday evening to be with us to talk about Vestry 101. And we're expecting a few more people here, and maybe they'll show, or maybe they are lost in Zoom land. And because we have a lot of material to cover, I'll keep the sort of introduction phase of this rather abbreviated and trust that you all make connections. Some words of just making gathering easier. So if you could stay on mute unless you have a question that you'd like to ask, that helps cut down on background noise. If you want to ask a question, because I'll be screen sharing, I won't be able to see everybody all the time. So if you could raise your hand, and if you don't know how to do that, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says reactions. And if you click on reactions, you should see something that says raise hand. So if you go ahead and use that, that's great. If I don't see you and just keep talking, as is my habit, there you go, Bill. Just unmute and say, Bishop, I have a question. That works too. You have a couple of different ways of viewing. If you, in the upper right-hand corner, you see view, there's speaker or gallery. So gallery helps you see lots of folks. Speaker helps you see the person who's talking, and that changes a little bit when I'm screen sharing as well. But just so you have those options, so that you can make it work for you. Any questions before we get right in? So if you could raise your hand if you are brand new to Vestry, you just got elected to Vestry at the most recent annual meeting. Can you raise your hand? Great. So we have a couple. Great. And if you have been on a Vestry 2 years or 3 years, can you raise your hand? Great. And if you've been on Vestry longer than that, can you raise your hand? Okay, great. And we have a few clergy who are serving on vestries perpetually, and we thank them for their service as well. So that's great. So this is Vestry 101. There's Vestry 201. There's Vestry 301 at spring training. This is very high level, just a big picture introduction to some words and phrases and terminology that might get thrown around, and just some good best practices that we have put together. And I want to begin by giving my thanks to Rebecca Hatch and her community, who really got this presentation together, and it's a lot of their shared wisdom that we will benefit from tonight. If at any point along the way you have a question, don't hesitate to ask. That's why we're here. We all come with lots of different experience. Great. So I am going to share my screen now, I think. And can you tell me if you can see that? Can you see a slide presentation? Thumbs up? Yes, great. Okay, perfect. So let me just change how I'm viewing you all so that I can, oops. There we go. And just a reminder, if you just joined us, I can't see everybody on my screen. So if you have a question, I'll just ask you to raise your hand. That would be great. Okay. Good. Welcome to Vestry 101, Spring Training 2023. So we're going to not do that right now. If there's time at the end, we might have time for more conversation, but I want to make sure we get to the crux of the material before we run out of time on introductions, as Episcopalians often do. So here are some guiding questions for our time together that I'd ask you to just keep in mind. Lots of folks talk about what they wish they had known before they joined their vestry. So what do you wish you had known before you joined vestry? A lot of folks have the experience of running for vestry, getting elected to vestry, and then finding out what the vestry is. That's not a unique experience, so that if that's yours, you're not alone. But then there might be some things that you really would have been helpful. And it's great to be able to share those things. The other question that will undergird all of our conversation tonight is, how is a vestry different than any other civic organization's leadership? And that can feel like an obvious answer. We are a religious institution. We have a particular mission in mind. We do our work guided by the Holy Spirit in prayer. The reason it's important to bring that up front in our conversation is the question that I often ask groups and vestries is, would you know it, right? So if that's true, if we are different than a civic organization, if you were joining your vestry meeting, would you know that it was any different than a civic organization, and how? So those are two important questions. I did realize that I did not introduce myself, and I probably should just do that quickly in case you don't know who you've joined today. I don't want to presume. My name is Jeff Mello. I am the Bishop Diocesan of the Episcopal Church in Connecticut for 6 months now. And before that, and why I can speak to this topic, is that I was a parish priest for about 15 years. And before that, I was clerk of my parish vestry So I know the pain that is clerkdom, and hats off to all the clerks in the room. So here's what we're going to talk about tonight in this 90 minutes that we have together, and I'll covenant to end on time. We're scheduled to end at 7:30. If you need to leave earlier, of course that's fine, but I will make sure that we are done no later than 7:30. Here's our agenda for our time together: the structure and governance of TEC, what we call TEC, which stands for the Episcopal Church. I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. What is a vestry? We'll talk about shared leadership and purpose of a vestry. We'll talk a little bit about the specifics of vestry meetings themselves, structures and processes. We'll talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities, and then we'll talk some about managing and leading, and how the vestry is really called to do both, to manage and to lead. And in addition to that, we'll talk about some resources as well as any questions you might have. So, structure and governance of TEC. So why do we say TEC, the Episcopal Church? If you've been in the Episcopal Church for a while, you might be more familiar with calling it the national church. Sometimes we would differentiate between the diocese and the national church. We've moved to calling it TEC because the Episcopal Church is larger than just the nation. So the Episcopal Church that we're a part of is the Episcopal Church in Connecticut, has dioceses all over the world. We have the convocation of Episcopal churches in Europe. We have churches in Central America. So there are dioceses that are not part of located in the United States of America. So we don't call it the national church anymore. We call it the Episcopal Church, or TEC for short. So if you hear somebody talk about TEC, that doesn't have to do with technology. That has not necessarily. It has to do with the Episcopal Church writ large, of which we are a part. The Episcopal Church is a member of the Anglican Communion. So the Anglican Communion is the worldwide collection of what we call provinces. So TEC is a province of the Anglican Communion. There are provinces all over the globe, and we are a part of that. The Anglican Communion is sort of like a federation. We agree to be in relationship with one another, but it's not top down any more than that. We are united by our relationship to the Church of England and to the Archbishop of Canterbury, for whom we pray every week, Justin, Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop's role is really to convene the communion. It's not a top-down relationship. The Archbishop of Canterbury can't say to a province, you must do this or you can't do this. All that the Anglican Communion groups that unite us can do is to choose who can be in relationship. So it's a federation. There are a couple of different groups. I talked about the Anglican Consultative Council is one. Lambeth Conference, you may have heard of. That's one. The Lambeth Conference is once every 10 years. The Archbishop of Canterbury invites all the bishops of the Anglican Communion. There's about 600 people who attend this once every 10-year conference in, excuse me, in Canterbury. Excuse me. So once every 10 years, all the bishops in the Anglican Communion get together and talk, have Bible study, consider the issues of the communion. In the Anglican Communion, TEC is one of the provinces. In the Episcopal Church, we have 109 dioceses in 17 nations and territories. So the Episcopal Church in Connecticut is one of 109 dioceses in the Episcopal Church. What that means is that not only there are 109 dioceses, Connecticut happens to be one of the dioceses where the state and the diocese are the same thing. That's true in places like Rhode Island, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, Hawaii, other dioceses. Some states have more than one diocese in it. So Massachusetts, for example, has the Diocese of Massachusetts and the Diocese of Western Massachusetts. So same state, two dioceses. The Diocese of Navajo Land goes over several states. So in Connecticut's case, again, the state and the diocese are the same thing, but that's not true in all 109 dioceses. That also means that there are 109 bishops diocesan. So there's a term for you, bishop diocesan. So bishop diocesan is what I am. So I am the bishop diocesan, which means that I am the ecclesiastical authority for the Episcopal Church in Connecticut. So anything that needs the official ecclesiastical authority for the diocese, that's part of my responsibility as bishop diocesan. In Connecticut, we also have Bishop Suffragan, right? Bishop Ahrens. So Bishop Ahrens and I are equal in order. So we're both fully bishops, both complete bishops. We can both do all the things that a bishop can do. Our roles are slightly different in that I am the bishop diocesan, as I said, and she's the bishop suffragan. So I'm the ecclesiastical authority, and Bishop Ahrens has other parts of her portfolio that she oversees. There are only, I think, 3 or 4 dioceses that have bishops suffragan. So there are not 109 bishops suffragan. There are only, I think there are 4 or 5 at this point. Texas and has a couple. New York has one, and Connecticut has one. So that's a little peek at the structure of the Episcopal Church. We are a diocese as the Episcopal Church in Connecticut. So a diocese is a group of parishes and a governing body within the Episcopal Church. We have right now 153, I think, parishes and worshiping communities. And we are, as I said, all over the state of Connecticut. Within the diocese, there are parishes, and then there are what we call intentional worshiping communities. So there are some people who are organized together as a community, but they're not an independent, freestanding parish. So I think like the Episcopal Church at Yale is an intentional worshiping community. Haven is another intentional worshiping community in the Episcopal Church in Connecticut. Any questions about the structure of the Episcopal Church? Any words you need me to go back over? Anything you've been wondering about that I didn't cover? Great. Oh, there's something. Let me just make sure I haven't missed something in chat. Yes, the slide deck will be available after the workshop. We'll make sure it goes out to, which is particularly important when we get to the resources. So thank you for asking that question. So governance. So each of those groups we just talked about, they have their own governance. So the Episcopal Church writ large meets for General Convention every 3 years. So the next General Convention of the Episcopal Church is in July of 2024. Now, if you are somebody who pays attention to these things, you know that we just had a convention in 2022. So this is only 2 years later, but it's because our last convention was postponed a year due to the pandemic. So we'll be getting back on our once every 3 year cycles in July of 2024. Why is it so important to get back on the 9-year cycle? We elect our presiding bishop for a 9-year term. So they get 3 trienniums. So Michael Curry, our presiding bishop, his term as our elected presiding bishop is over at our next General Convention, and we will be electing a new presiding bishop next July 2024. For those of you who don't know this, the Constitution and canons of the Episcopal Church were put together around the same time and by some of the same people that our country's Constitution was put together, right? So our structure looks very much like our country's structure. We are a democratic church, right? The lay people vote and send representatives to our larger bodies. Our bishops are elected. They are not appointed. Our presiding bishop is elected. We have two houses at General Convention. We have a House of Bishops and a House of Deputies. The House of Bishops, as you may guess, is made up of all bishops, active and retired. The House of Deputies is made up of clergy and lay people who are elected by their diocese to represent their diocese to General Convention. So when we meet in convention, some of the people we elect are representatives to this once every 3-year convention. In between general conventions, there's what's called the Executive Council. So they meet in between to do any of the ongoing work in between conventions. So that's the general structure of the Episcopal Church. At the diocesan level, our structure is annual convention. So every fall, and this year our convention is on October 28th and 29th at the Hartford Convention Center. Our convention is held every fall. Parishes elect lay delegates and clergy. So much like the General Convention has a House of Deputies and a House of Bishops, at our convention, every parish gets votes and every clergy person gets a vote. So there are some votes that have to be taken by order, we call it. So lay order and the clergy order. One example of that is, I don't know, a bishop election, right? So last year at the bishop election, in order to be elected, the candidate has to have gotten the majority of lay votes and clergy votes on the same ballot. So that's one example of when we take votes by order. Sometimes we just take a general majority vote. But you can still see that dual house sense to our structure. So parishes send lay delegates and clergy to the convention every year. And some recent and this is where everything happens. So in the Episcopal Church, everything comes from the ground up. I know it doesn't always feel that way. Sometimes it can feel like, the diocese has got another thing that the parishes need to be doing, right? Anything that the diocese asks parishes to be doing came out of our annual convention at the request of the delegates in the room at convention. So if you want to have influence and a say in how we organize our common life, the best way to do that is to make sure your parish is sending their full delegation to convention in the fall. A lot of people say, I don't, it's a day and a half of time I don't have, it doesn't make any difference. It does make a difference because anything we do as a diocese happens and comes out of annual convention as far as resolutions go. So budget comes before convention. Things like salary schedule for clergy comes out of convention. And then other resolutions that we live into, like Safe Church or anti-racism training, all of that are resolutions that come before convention. Resolutions can come out of local parishes. They can come out of ministry networks. They can come out of groups of people who say, this is really something we want the diocese as a whole, or the Episcopal Church in Connecticut as a collected body of people to be thinking about. Any questions about governance? In between annual convention, we have standing committee and we have mission council, which are two bodies that meet in between to continue the business of the diocese. The mission council really acts as convention in between conventions, and then standing committee are the fiduciary. We'll talk a little bit about that. The fiduciary responsible group. Jackie, please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question about the representative from the parish that goes to the annual convention. Is there a standard time of year that that representative is elected by the parish to attend? Or is there just sort of just before the convention, the parish asks someone if they'd like to serve?
That's a terrific question, Jackie. Thank you for asking. Typically, the election of your convention representatives would happen at the same time the election of your vestry or any other elections would happen.
Okay.
So for most parishes, that's the annual meeting. If there are vacancies, and usually you do like representatives and then alternates in case those people can't make it. If there happens to be a vacancy, that's something that can be taken up by the vestry in between annual meetings. Did I answer your question, Jackie? Is that helpful? Good. Okay. Any other questions? So here's Mission Council. I talked a little bit about Mission Council, which is one of our governing bodies in ECCT. It's the governing body between conventions. It meets quarterly, and membership of Mission Council are the bishops, the secretary and treasurer of the diocese, region representatives, and ministry network representatives. So people from all of those bodies come together quarterly to continue discussing the work of convention. So here's the other body, is standing committee. The standing committee is 6 clergy and 6 lay members. And we elect one in each order. Remember, clerical, clergy is an order, lay is an order. So one in each order at every annual convention. So this convention, we will elect 1 clergy person to standing committee and 1 lay person to standing committee. They serve 3-year terms, and their primary job is counsel of advice to me and to Bishop Ahrens. And should there be an absence of a bishop, they become the ecclesiastical authority of the diocese. I'm hoping that doesn't happen in the next little while, but just so you know, should there not be a bishop in place, it would be the standing committee. They oversee grants, consents for ECCT, parish real estate matters. So if a parish wants to sell a building or enter into a lease that's longer than a year, that's where the standing committee gets involved, and they need to sign off on that. Any questions about Mission Council or standing committee? Great. So here's a little conversation about what Vestry is and what Vestry is not. Vestry is focused on God's mission, right? That is the end goal. That is the purpose of why we gather as Vestry. Vestry is not focused only on administration and oversight of budget and property. And I know that the reality on the ground is that a lot of the work of the vestry is about administration and oversight of budget and property. But what this invitation is to remember that those are being considered, administration and budget and property are being considered through the lens of God's mission, right? It's not profit margin. It's not, a stakeholders meeting that we have to report to. We are doing what we're doing in order to further God's work in the world. And that's the guiding principle behind all of our work as vestries. A vestry is a community of prayer and discerning of the Holy Spirit. So if your vestry meets, and I would invite you, if you don't already, to at least be opening and closing your meetings in prayer. that prayer is at least a parenthesis on your time together. I want to invite the lay people to try that on. Sometimes when I would have a vestry meeting, I'd say, would somebody like us to lead us in prayer? And it can't be anybody with a collar. So clergy are not the only ones that can pray. And sometimes we're not the best ones in the room to be offering prayer. So are you fostering a community of prayer? Vestry is not a secular group. This is, in fact, a faith-based organization. And again, the question, how is that reflected in your time together? Would anybody know that you were a community of followers of Jesus Christ if they were sitting in on your meeting? And that's not just about prayer at the beginning and the end. It's how we talk with each other. It's how we disagree with one another. It's how we make decisions. Everything is guided first and foremost in prayer and relationship with God. A vestry is willing to try on new ideas and take some time to dream, which is, you have to be disciplined about that when all you have are the crises and the next thing that needs to be decided. And it is not just focused on maintenance. And that just doesn't mean, when we say maintenance there, that's not just about repairing the boiler. That's about just keeping things as it is, that there's some opportunity to wonder and to dream as a group. A vestry is willing to work collaboratively with other parishes and social service organizations to learn about and to serve God's mission. So one thing I want to say here is, I think that the #1 job description for a parish vestry is to be the parish's spiritual leaders. And I know that that scares a lot of vestry members, and it would often be something that made people nervous about joining vestry at my parish. But vestries are microcosms of the parish. And the parish is a microcosm of the world around us, right? So we gather as communities of faith to practice being together in a way that we hope the world could be together, right? How we gather as vestry ought to reflect how we want our congregation to be together, right? So in order to build spiritual leaders in your community, the vestry needs to take on as part of their a central part of their identity that they are the spiritual leaders of the community. That doesn't mean that they're leading workshops on praying with icons, unless that's something they're good at, and in which case, by all means. It simply means that they are demonstrating to the gathered community what our hopes and dreams for the gathered community as a community gathered in Christ would be. Any questions about that? Okay, ask anytime. Not just focused on survival, right? I know that particularly in smaller parishes, survival is a motivating factor. And part of that is, again, going back to the why. Why survive? What is critical, but what does God need your local community to be doing to further God's dream for the world? Okay, so now we turn our attention a little bit to vestry meetings. Do you think this? Yes, I am. Oh, that was a direct message. I will get to resources, and sorry, somebody just sent me a question. Absolutely. So process and structures of meetings. So please follow. So one of the great gifts you can give your vestry, if you don't already do this, and to your community, is transparency, right? And predictability. So when folks are coming to a vestry meeting, do they know what they're coming to discuss in general terms? Does your gathered community know what the vestry will be discussing in general terms? That can build a great deal of trust between a vestry and a congregation. If on the Sunday before your vestry is meeting, somebody says that in the announcements, just a reminder, vestry meets on 7 o'clock on Tuesday night, a reminder that vestry meetings are open to the entire community. If you're curious about what we're talking about, we'd love to have you join us, but that there's an agenda published ahead of time. So it's not a secret meeting happening behind closed doors. It has a start time and an end time, and you covenant to keep those. And there's no shame, I mean, people have lives, right? So pick up at school went a little long because the teacher had to talk to you about something. You arrive a little late for a meeting. Okay, but the meeting starts. So it's a good way of just honoring people's time together, and everybody can relax a little bit because they know that their time will be honored, and that if the meeting's supposed to end at 8:15, it will end at 8:15. I am known to end meetings early, but I do that so I can bank the time and use it at another time. So I haven't had to do that yet here, but it's a strategy. Follow an agenda. The vestry meeting is chaired by a rector or someone else designated by the rector. That's in our canons. A vestry models Christian community. So that seems obvious, and it's a really hard practice, particularly when feelings are involved. The emotional temperature can rise, and people can revert to not being their best selves. And vestry is a place we really want to commit and covenant, and I'll say a little bit more about that, covenant our best Christian behavior and how we agree to be with one another. The vestry values voices of all the members. Sometimes vestries go into default mode where they default to the voices of those who have been in the room the longest, or who have been in the church the longest, or as I call it, the tyranny of the articulate. So there are some people who just really good at knowing how to talk and think off the top of their head, and they can just jump right in and start going. And then there are other people who need a little bit more space and time to gather their thoughts and think about what they want to say before jumping in. A vestry wants to figure out how to hold both of those realities so that everybody gets their voice in the room. And then, of course, you want your clerk to take notes to create minutes of a meeting. A little bit about taking minutes. Minutes are really, in 100 years, somebody's going to want to know what they meant by the Bishop Mello waddling duck fund for pastoral ministry, right? Like that got decided in some vestry meeting somewhere, and now people are trying to figure out what to do with it. So the minutes are for the people who will come after us, but they don't have to detail. And then Wendy said this, and then Bill said this, and then Jill said this, and then it is for publication to the larger community so that they also know what's going on. We talk about confidentiality in vestry, and you want to agree as a vestry what you all mean by confidentiality. What we would mean is that, of course, vestry members were to talk about what we talked about in the room, but not tell other people's stories. So if somebody shared something in vestry meeting that I didn't share, that wouldn't be mine to tell. We also covenanted that once a vestry came to a conclusion, we were all of one on that decision. So I might not have agreed with the decision, but then the decision becomes the decision of the vestry. And as a member of the vestry, I agree to live into that. These are guidelines for mutuality, which if you've been around ECCT for a while, you might be familiar with. These are written on newsprint, and they are in every conference room at the Commons where our diocesan offices are. Try it on. So rather than immediately saying, no, just try it on and wonder. It's okay to disagree. Sometimes in church, we think we're supposed to always get along and be nice and agree. And what that really does is just drive conflict and disagreement underground, and usually right to the parking lot. So we want to just know it's okay to disagree. It's not okay to blame, shame, or attack ourselves or other people. We practice self-focus. We take responsibility for our own learning. We practice both and thinking. Should we do this or this? Well, is there a possibility that it might be this and this, right? No, sometimes we get into sort of a dichotomy that we have to choose either this or this, and sometimes the truth. That happens a lot in scripture, both and, right? There are these things that seem like they're opposite, like the cross, right? Which is a sign of death and also the triumph of life over death at the same time. We notice both our process and our content. We're aware of intent and impact. And what that means, if you're not familiar with that, is I may say something that hurts somebody else in the room, and I might not have meant to hurt them, but ultimately, whether or not I meant it doesn't change the fact that it had that effect, that impact, right? So we have to own that just not having the intent doesn't nullify the impact, and we hold both. And then we talked a little bit about maintain confidentiality. What is self-focus? Great. So just being aware of ourselves in the room and use I statements. So here's one thing that I used to talk a lot about is sometimes in Vestry meetings, somebody would say, can I just be the devil's advocate for a second? And I would say, well, last time I checked the news, the devil doesn't need any advocates, right? The devil's doing just fine. So that's really in it. Sometimes people like to bring in other voices that aren't based in any truth. And I would really encourage folks to speak for themselves. So I have a question about this. I wonder about this. I don't agree with this. I would have a hard time if we ended up doing this. So it's just focusing on ourselves and using I statements rather than some people think or I heard that. It's really just focusing on using I statements. I think, I know, I feel. Hopefully that helps. So those are Vestry meetings. I'm a big fan of Vestry retreats, and we have resources like people and ideas at the Commons. The Commons, just in case you don't know, the Commons is what we call our office, our diocesan offices. It's in Meriden. It's a converted ball bearing factory, and it's a wild space. It's open and airy and light filled. And if you're ever in the area, please stop by. But that's what we that's what we mean when we say the Commons is our diocesan offices. So we have some resources, but Vestry retreats can be really important to the life of a diocese. I invite you to consider doing this once a year. We would do it twice a year. We would do sort of a business onboarding visioning retreat, and then we would do a nourishing feeding growth retreat. You know, being on Vestry is tough. It's a lot of hard work. You're putting out, you know, ideas and energy and trying to get move the parish forward. So doing something that's renewing your own spiritual relationship can be very, very important. Be clear about the purpose of a Vestry retreat, business retreat, or both. In the church, we love to, we call everything a retreat. And sometimes it's really a business meeting, and that's fine as long as you're clear with folks about that up front. So we're going to have a Vestry retreat and we're going to be in meetings from 9 to 2. So just so folks know what they're getting into, so they don't think they're coming to one thing and getting another. And again, I invite you to do both. You can do both in one. A lot of folks go use Camp Washington for their Vestry retreats, which is a great resource. And if you do an overnight, you could do business on one day and something more nourishing on the other, or you could build in free time or do spiritual guided hikes or whatever. So there's opportunities, but don't underestimate the Vestry's need for their own spiritual attention and growth. They can be used for setting longer term goals, hopes and dreams. This is one of those times where you can get out of the day-to-day and really focus on where do we want to be in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, or do some bigger thinking about a project you've been talking about but can't ever seem to get traction on. It's a chance for longer discussion. Sometimes Vestry meetings can feel rushed. It's the end of the day a lot. So it's a time to get away and have some longer discussions. Could be off-site, can involve a meal, whatever. You can really put something together that suits the needs of your local community in Vestry. And of course, be aware of specific needs of your group. And consider this a budget line item. Maybe get an outside leader. So if there's room in your parish budget for some sort of Vestry retreat, that helps make sure that it happens. Any questions on retreat? And there are great books too. I mean, there's so many resources about Vestry retreats. So building the agenda for your time together, and just because your agenda has always looked one way does not mean it needs to look that way forever, right? So really paying attention to your agenda can really revitalize how you're together. And we're learning more and more from organizational development world about what makes for a good Vestry meeting, what makes for a good meeting. We know that our attention span is not what it was 50 years ago. Our attention span is not what it was pre-COVID. So again, when I got to my parish, I was told that meetings started at 7 and sometimes would go until 10:30 or 11. 10:30 is way past my bedtime. And I know that at about hour 2, I would get diminished returns, right? So what is your group need? What makes good sense for a time start? Some parishes have their Vestry meet after church on a Sunday, because that works for people. Some people meet, on a weeknight. Whatever works for your local community. But who sets the agenda? Is it the rector? Is the rector and wardens? How do people get items on the agenda? Can a parishioner get an agenda item put on there? And how do they know they can do that? Some reoccurring items on Vestry agendas, spiritual focus. So again, we would spend the first half hour of our Vestry meeting each month in a spiritual exercise. Sometimes that was Lectio Divina or dwelling in the Word. Sometimes that was teaching a prayer practice. Sometimes it was teaching something of interest that the Vestry had been wondering about, but a real commitment to making sure that before we did anything else, we were steeping ourselves in our spiritual discipline. Then you review the minutes from the previous meeting, treasurer's report. Now, at our place, we decided that our situation was such that we didn't need a treasurer's report in detail every month. So we moved to quarterly treasurer reports, gave the treasurer a little bit more time on the agenda to go a little bit more in depth. And then monthly, they would do like a treasurer check-in, like all is good, things are on track. My report is next month. So even that can be something you can look at. Sometimes there's updates on ongoing projects. Sometimes vestries have committees or ministry areas come in and present because the vestry doesn't know what the centering prayer group does, or the vestry doesn't know what the prayer shawl ministry is up to or what they do. So sometimes it's really helpful to the vestry to have groups come in and talk. And then when do we do strategic planning, the bigger question? And then when does the vestry receive the agenda? So again, I would always ask that the agenda go out a week ahead of time, but certainly before the Sunday before the vestry meeting, so that the congregation at large would have an opportunity to know what was on the agenda for the meeting. So this is, thanks again to Rebecca Hatch, this is an example of a very short vestry meeting. It goes from 4 to 5:15, and it it talks about opening prayer. It talks about dwelling in the word, closing prayer. It asks people to read the minutes beforehand and submit changes ahead of time, which I don't know about you, but if you're ever been in a vestry meeting where you know people are reading the minutes in the meeting, and then it starts being a meeting about semicolons, that's when you know that maybe there's a different way and you want to be spending your time together, not talking about punctuation. So then you see updates, rector's report, approval of minutes, and then closing prayer. We would also always put our financial decisions, our financial conversations later in the meeting, so that it didn't end up being that we spent all of the time talking about financial decisions and then didn't get to any of the programmatic or visioning work. And that helped us in our local context. And then, of course, upcoming dates and events, so folks have that on their calendar. This is just one version of an agenda. What is a rector's report? Great question. Thank you for asking. So a rector's report, I would use that time to just update the vestry on what was happening in the life of the parish. I would talk about activities I had been involved in, if I had done something with the interfaith community, or I would talk about things that were happening in the life of the diocese. I would talk about particularly important pastoral matters. So sometimes there are seasons of really difficult pastoral care that can sometimes come in waves, and sometimes it was important for the vestry to know that. So that's really the rector's opportunity to bring whatever they think the vestry needs to know to the vestry. It could also be a time for the vestry to ask the rector questions about what's happening in the life of the parish. Who, when, and where of a vestry meeting? So who attends vestry meetings? Well, vestry members, of course, all officers, the rector, delegates to ECCT annual convention. So that's not a practice in a lot of places, and it's a really good practice to get into, because what we hope is that the delegates to convention are a liaison between the diocese and the parish, and the parish and the diocese. So in order for them to bring back to the parish what's happening in the diocese, they need to be able to have that relationship and that bridge. If they're at the vestry meeting and they're not a vestry member, of course, they have a voice but not vote. And then any member of the parish who desires to attend. Also, we every once in a while would rethink when the vestry meeting should be. We usually landed on the same day and the same time out of habit, but we would make a practice of asking that at least once a year. Does this day and time still work? It just gave folks permission to think differently if something needed to change. If there is no rector, then the warden would conduct the meeting as because the wardens are the ecclesiastical authority in the absence of a rector. So it would be the wardens who would conduct the vestry meeting. Great question. When are vestry meetings and how long are vestry meetings, right? So again, as you saw, that vestry meeting is 1 hour and 15 minutes. In my parish, vestry started at 7:30 and we ended at 9:30. I want to say 9:30 sounds late to me, but you know, again, that's not in the canons. You get to decide that for your group, and you get to do things like sometimes we would have our regularly scheduled vestry meetings, and then we would call special vestry meetings, and then we got into the habit of sometimes we needed to call an extra special vestry meeting, and usually that was our cookout in June. We would call that our extra special vestry meeting. And we would do things like, you know, our June meeting would usually be a cookout at, you know, at somebody's house or in the backyard of the church. In December, the same thing. Sometimes we would have it off-site and maybe move our business to another time or another day and just have time of companionship and conversation and community building. So, just a question. In March, when I looked, the canons on the ECCT website were either 2018 or 2020. I ended up buying 2022 online. Colleen, can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so you're talking about all the different canons to refer to.
Yeah,
I know that I've been thoroughly through ECCT site because I joined the parish in 2019 and kind of opened my mouth about the digital presence, and then COVID hit. So
yeah,
when I went on to see if there was an update, because I realized it was a couple years old. It is old on the ECCT site. And I know we update the canons every year because we meet on a regular basis.
oh,
So it was just an FYI to you that
right.
I chose to actually buy it because I wanted to print it out. I just chose to buy it so I can highlight and manually read it instead of having a digital version. So I wanted, while I had you, to let you know.
Yes, great. So I think this is a really good question, and stay with me for just a second because I want to make sure I have this correct. I think 2018, I think might be the last time we updated our diocesan canons. And what you probably bought online for 2022 were the Constitution and canons for the Episcopal Church.
Correct. Tech.
Yes.
Your
So
tech,
those.
your tech ones, because you do have a link on your ECCT site
Okay,
for Great
great.
Tech, is also outdated.
Awesome.
I
Good to know.
already have the other ones too. So that's
Great.
I'm
I just
trying to
wanted to know
learn
which you were
Catholic.
talking about, the tech
Yep.
ones or the, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I'm just writing myself a note right now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. So the link to the tech canons is old. Great. Awesome. Executive session. So what is an executive session? An executive session is that matters discussed are held in confidence. So this is a time where it would only be vestry members, officers, and the rector present, and that the discussion is not recorded in the minutes. These are used sparingly. Generally, they're used for personnel matters. And some vestries have never gone into an executive session and never will. They're not regular occurrences, but they are available should there be something that you would need only vestry members present for. So let me give you an example. In my parish, the associate rector would often come to vestry. Other members of the staff would often come to vestry. If we needed to start talking about what we were going to be doing about salaries in the budget, we would move into executive session, which just mean that anybody who wasn't on vestry would leave, and no votes are taken in executive session either. That's correct. So it's a time for conversation and discussion, right? So we could talk about what we're doing in as far as salaries go, but then the vote for the budget based on that information would be public. Great. Thank you. But that's important for you to know that it exists. So roles and responsibilities on a vestry. So there are clergy responsibilities and there are vestry responsibilities. And it's good to know these before there's any confusion. So you want to, we just had that great conversation about getting the latest canons, right? You want to avoid having to pull those out to settle a question of whose responsibility is it to do a particular thing in the parish. So in general terms, the clergy person is responsible for the worship and spiritual life of the church. So what does that mean? It would mean that the vestry would not vote as to whether to use Rite 2 or Rite 1 on Sunday morning, unless the clergy person brought it to vestry for consideration and advice, right? Because that's the clergy person's responsibility and purview. It is the clergy person, and this is new information for lots of folks. It's the clergy person has the responsibility for the use and control of the buildings and the furnishings. So again, lots of clergy and rectors and priests in charge will delegate that responsibility to the vestry, but ultimately it would have been my purview to say whether or not the sanctuary could be used for a concert. Because canonically, the space use and control would be my responsibility. The clergy responsibility is the education for all ages. And again, this isn't that they have to do it. They are responsible for making sure that it gets done. Scripture, doctrine, worship, stewardship, baptism, confirmation, recording of baptisms, marriages, and confirmations. So when you have a bishop visitation, one of the things that Bishop Aarons and I will do when we visit is to check the parish registers. And so we look to make sure that they're all up to date. Your baptisms, marriages, confirmations, burials, and then your service register. The priest in charge or the rector is responsible for the selection and supervision of assisting clergy. So if there is another clergy person on staff, like an assistant rector or an associate rector or a curate, that person is hired by the rector or the priest in charge. That the priest in charge or the rector may do that in consultation with the vestry and may even create a search committee of vestry. That's that person's purview. But ultimately, a secondary clergy person reports to the rector and not to the vestry. Okay, that's important. And then final authority and administration of matters pertaining to music, which often can, that's a good thing to know, is that ultimately it is the priest in charge or the clergy person's responsibility for all music, and that decision is often delegated either to a church musician or another staff person. Any questions on clergy responsibilities? Vestry responsibilities. The vestry are the agents and legal representatives for property and relations of parish to clergy. The vestry is responsible for ensuring that standard business methods are followed. And in the resources, we'll talk a little bit about how you know if you're following standard business methods. If a parish is without a rector, the officers are responsible for the continuation of worship and calling of a new rector or priest in charge. So anybody who's currently without clergy knows how challenging a task that is. That's a lot of work. And it is the responsibility of the officers to make sure that that happens. And it's also the vestry's responsibility to nominate someone for holy orders. So if someone feels a call to ordination, at some point in that process, they would come before the vestry to be sponsored for ordination, for nominated for ordination. And then they would be presented for consideration to the ordination process. Any questions about the roles and responsibilities of the vestry? Okay. More specific. The
Sorry,
vestry,
right,
oh, please.
In the notes, can you go back a slide? Someone did
Yeah.
ask for further explanation on the first item, being agents and legal representatives of the church.
Yeah, where did I go? Did I do? There we go. Yes. So if the great question, if the parish is interested in entering into a formal contract, it is the vestry that signs that contract. So you're getting a new roof put on, you're getting solar panels, you are hiring a new waste disposal company. It is the vestry that enters into those legal contracts. So it would be the vestry that would be the representative for, and then relations of parish to clergy, that's negotiating the letter of agreement. That's if there's a conflict, figuring out how to address the conflict. That's engaging in regular mutual ministry reviews with your clergy person. If you're in the priest in charge process, that's built in a little bit, but even if you have a rector, there ought to be a regular time of mutual ministry, which I think I'm going to talk a little bit about, but I'll say now that's actual mutual ministry, right? That's both in both ways. How's the rector doing? And how is the parish doing? And how are you working together in shared ministry? Does that I hope that answers your question. If not, just hop back on. So keeping the voting records of the parish, property and all business affairs of the parish. So here's a little bit more detail, subject to the direction, management, and control of the vestry. So except disposition of real estate and the borrowing and lending of money, that also includes the standing committee, right? The standing committee is involved in those matters. It's the vestry's responsibility to inform the bishop if a clergy person is leaving. Hopefully the bishop will already know that from the clergy person. But if that's not the case, there should be official notification from the vestry. And then again, risk management. So how, who's paying attention to your insurance? Is your insurance adequate enough? I hope that you know that we have a new property insurance agency and church insurance. I'm really excited about that. I think it's a great product. It's a good company. Most parishes, not all, but most parishes in the diocese saw a decrease in premium when we moved to church insurance. For some, it stayed the same, and for a couple, it went up, but mostly we saw decreases. But there's a great service component to church insurance. So you can call church insurance and say, can somebody come do a walkthrough at St. Swithin's and help us just get a sense of what risk we might have. And they'll come on the property and they'll say, you want to take a look at that, or you want to, think about replacing that door, or, have you thought about this alarm system, and they'll make recommendations. And so this is the church insurance. This is the insurance company I used when I was in parish ministry, and I had a great experience with them. But it's the vestry's responsibility to make sure that things are up to date and that you're managing your risk. You're making sure that your safe church policies are being implemented. So that you're managing your risk, at the minimum, managing risk from a safe church perspective. Hopefully, the dream and the hope is that the clergy and the vestry of a parish are working together as partners in ministry. So there's their team. There are clear boundaries, clear expectations. There's a letter of agreement establishing this. It sets the tone at the beginning. There's a great book that I'll talk about later called Hitting the Ground Running, which I highly recommend to you. Neither clergy nor vestry can be effective without the support and cooperation of the other, right? A good vestry makes for a good clergy leader, and a good clergy leader makes for a good vestry. It's a collaborative ministry that calls for accommodation and teamwork. And then here's the mutual ministry review that I talked about. This is an ongoing process that can be done with outside consultants. And again, you can be in touch with us at the Commons if you need help with that. New member orientation. And again, I said at the beginning that some vestry members find out what being on the vestry means after they've already been elected and are attending their first vestry meeting. So how you orient new members is really important. So we would have a binder that we would give folks that would have 12 months of minutes so that they could read those ahead of time. Because, you walk into your first vestry meeting and everybody's mid-conversation, or as I like to say, now back to your regularly scheduled programming already in progress, right? Like people have no idea what you're talking about because you've been having this conversation for a while, but it's new to them. So how do you get them up to speed? Do they meet with the rector? Do they meet with the wardens and the treasurer? Sometimes it's really, I would have the treasurer meet with new members to just look at the parish budget together, so that they are getting a sense of how to read a budget and how to read the church's budget and what does that line item mean and what does that have to say. Colleen.
So my thought process has been when I came on is that we joined the Google platform at St. Andrews. What is your stance on if you feel that going in that direction is secure? Because I haven't had a lot of guidance, nor have I had time to actually sit down like I want to with people from the Commons to ensure that we're abiding by safe data practices. I feel like Google is a safe platform, which is why I promoted it. But are you comfortable with us loading and utilizing that as the primary resource and keeping the physical materials as a secondary resource for our
You mean for
churches?
things like minutes and
Minutes, contracts, so like anything that would be junior warden, senior warden, treasurer, anything like that to be digitalized.
Yeah.
St. Andrews has had floods. So for
Yeah.
me, I
Yeah.
always feel like fail safes, fail safes, fail safes.
Yeah.
I'm also hoping to be moving my church. Like I want these fail safes. Is it safe in your opinion? Do you have a thought process or a direction that you could provide to make sure that we have,
that's a great question.
Yeah, because we did the nonprofit route to make sure that we had a whole platform and we assigned our entire domain that way.
Yeah.
But I wanted to know what limitations to load.
Yeah, that's great. Great question. We use the Google platform. We use shared drives. You can password protect them. I would just think about sensitive material and where you're keeping that, things like account numbers and passwords, all the stuff that you would do personally. And church insurance will have great information on digital risk management. So that's actually where I would go, Colleen, is I would give a quick call or hop on to church insurance and see what they have to say about if you want something other than I talked to the bishop and he thought it was a good idea because he had used it. How do we access church insurance? So at the Commons, you can call Matt Handy, M-A-T-T, and his last name is H-A-N-D-I. He can get you in touch and he might have opinions himself on this topic, but you can also just Google Church Insurance of Vermont is the title, and they'll ask you where you are, what diocese you're from, and get you to the right person. They are, I would not hesitate to call them. And if you have anything but good experience, please do let us know, but they've been really good.
Before you move on, a lot of messages came through. Someone did ask, what about staff, adding or cutting hours to your staff position, for example?
Yeah, great. And I think the question is, whose authority is that? I'm trying to remember who asked that question.
Mary Barnett.
Mary's on phone in DC. So and that's a two-pronged answer, Mary. One is the budgetary realities, and the other is how the budgetary realities get affected, right? So I would imagine that if there was a budget shortfall and the decision was made that staffing needed to be cut, or that you needed to reduce the line items for staff, that would be a Vestry conversation, but how those cuts got enacted would be at the clergy's discretion in conversation with the Vestry. Hopefully these would happen at the same time, but for the Vestry to say we are short $20,000 and this is where it needs to come out of is a little bit outside of the Vestry's responsibilities. It would be, we have a shortfall, we can't figure out anywhere else except in staffing for this cut to come, and then have that conversation with your clergy person about where that cut would come from if it had to come. Okay. Be intentional about new or member orientation, and then bylaws, parish bylaws, previous minutes, safe church practices, Vestry resource guide, which I'll talk about. Those are all good things to be able to hand new Vestry members. There's the Vestry resource guide. Oh, I don't have to go get mine and show it to you because that's what it looks like. You can order this directly from the Episcopal Church Foundation, and don't worry about writing it down. I've got more information coming your way. This is a really great resource. Things like job descriptions, lots of templates, lots of how to do a lot of what we talked about tonight. We would give this to every member of the vestry, and we would order them every time a new one came out. So highly recommend it. So here's a subtopic, which is the relationship between vestries and committees. So the whole process of asking and discussing and imagining and trying on the question about committees and how they function in your parish. So do you have committees? Is there a committee system, or should there be, right? So in some places, vestry members each have a committee that they are assigned to. So when you get elected vestry member for children and youth, right? Or vestry member for buildings and grounds. And in some places, the committee structure is completely separate from the vestry. But have a conversation about how your committees interact with your vestry, so they're not siloed, but they're also not duplicating. So if you, and this would come up in parish ministry a lot, if you have a committee that you've asked to do something, if you've ever served on a committee that was asked to do something and then it went to another body that redid all that work, you know how demoralizing that can be, right? And what you've basically done is taken any power and authority away from the committee that was established to do that work. So you really want to honor the work of your committees and not duplicate the work, but figure out where the role and responsibility of the vestry begins and ends, and where the roles and responsibility of the committee begins and ends. And please have a conversation about how do you sunset committees, right? So in the church, we love to add programs and we love to add committees. We don't love so much sunsetting or letting them go. But if you have a committee that nobody ever wants to be on, that doesn't ever do anything, but you go through that annual angst of, we really need somebody for the such and such committee, maybe there's a conversation that the vestry could be having about whether or not that committee and or ministry or program is needed anymore. And that can, I don't say that easily, because sometimes those committees or ministries or programs come with great history that meant a great deal to a lot of people over a long time. But like anything else, sometimes those things outlive their purpose and it's not needed anymore. And it's okay to have that conversation, right? We know in scripture about pruning trees, right? That pruning helps other things grow more vitally. So that can sometimes be a difficult but important conversation for the vestry to be having. Yeah, right. Sometimes that committee is stewardship, and that is a different question. Although sometimes, and this is radical and scary, and sometimes it's, if nobody wants to serve on this committee, is God telling us that we're not going to have that committee right now? Well, what will that mean for stewardship? Well, what will that mean for stewardship? And what will the ramifications of not having that committee be? And sometimes you have to dwell in that really uncomfortable, scary place for the larger group to lean in with some ownership. Doesn't always work, doesn't always happen, Sometimes the same 20% of people still will do the same 80% of the work. And as Mary points out, we have to be careful that the default committee person isn't always the clergy person who's left holding the ball, because there's an awkward relationship between being the clergy person in a parish and stewardship, because at one, you want to be talking about the theological underpinnings of stewardship, and at the end of the day, that the success of the stewardship campaign has very real consequences on not only the ministry and life of the parish, but your own life in ministry. Yeah, right. It meant that the wardens and the clergy had to be that, right? Judy's asked, what are other committees in vestries that others have now? So if you want to hop into chat. The one thing I didn't say at the beginning that I'll say now, my gosh, 7:21, is I hope that you are creating networks of vestries. So find another vestry in a parish that's either near you or like you, and form some connections, because I've talked a lot tonight, but the folks who really know this topic are you all. And those of you who are in the trenches doing the work. So get in there, see what connections you can make through your region missioner. See if there are other vestries who sometimes we would do vestry offsites with other vestries, just to share challenges and joys, and just get ideas from one another. Great. This is just a lot of what we just talked about. The balance between managing and leading, the vestry is called to do both, right? Envisioning, engaging, empowering, energizing, exemplifying, talking about the parish identity. Who are we? Where are we going? Who is God inviting to help us move forward? Who is the leadership in the parish? So there's the management, the bills got to be paid, the lights got to be on, and then there's the leading, right? Where are we going? Who are we? What is our bigger vision? So those are both tasks of a vestry to be held together in relationship. So here are the resources. This is the top 10 resources for vestries in David Letterman style. The Bible, of course, is highly recommended. Lots of really great stories about leadership in the Bible. The Book of Common Prayer, that's often a great gift also to give to vestry members, so that you can be, one thing I always would ask my vestry to covenant to is that they would be praying for each other on a daily basis. Nothing changes your relationship with a person than saying their name in prayer. So I highly recommend that. Vestry Papers. Vestry Papers is another resource from the Episcopal Church Foundation. You see the phone number down there at the bottom. And again, I'll send these slides out. But those you can get them emailed, really great topics and articles all the time, reflections. You can get a subscription. They deliver them to you. Really, really great, robust resource. And then there's the Vestry Resource Guide, which we showed you from Forward Movement. The Human Resource Practices for Lay Employees in Episcopal Churches. Not everybody needs one of those, but it might be good to have a copy for your parish. Same thing with the Clergy Tax Return Preparation Guide. Just a good resource to have nearby. And then the book that I recommended earlier, How to Hit the Ground Running, a quick start guide for congregations with new leadership. And I will tell you that in my 15 years of parish ministry, I would go back to How to Hit the Ground Running over and over and over again. Because the life cycle of a parish, sometimes every 3 years, there's something new and something to revisit. And they're just really good resources. Just check the questions here. Oh, great. ECFVP.org is Vestry Papers. That is the end of my slideshow. We have 5 minutes left. If there are any questions or thoughts or wonderings, anything that didn't get, oh, look how many of you are here. that did not get answered in our time together. Any questions for me? And again, there's a Vestry 201, there's a Vestry 301. They go a little bit deeper into topics. I hope that some of you will be able to join us on Saturday for our in-person training. We have a great keynote speaker coming to talk about this idea of invite, welcome, connect. How do we invite people into our communities? Once they're there, how do we welcome them into our communities? And once they're welcomed, how do we connect them more deeply into our community? So I'm really excited about Saturday if you're able to be there. Any final thoughts or questions?
Bishop Mello, will you
Yes.
be conducting Vestry 201 or 301?
I'm not. They didn't trust me to go higher level in my first year, I think. So I got to do 101, and if I do a good job, maybe, but other folks are leading 201 and 301, and they're spectacular. We always have great feedback in previous years, I know, from 201 or 301. So please do come back. I am doing 101 on Saturday. That's an in-person workshop that's also going to have. So, and I think you will, I'm positive that you will be getting an evaluation. So feel free, be honest, be loving and honest, and let us know if there was anything that we did not cover that you were hoping to, because this is for you. That's the only reason we do this. Is to support you all in the hard and sacrificial work of being Vestry. Let us pray. God, you are so very good to us. We thank you for making good on your promise that when 2 or 3 of us would gather, you would be in the midst of us, because you have certainly been here in this time together. Be with each person on this Zoom call. Help them to know of your presence with them, but Lord, also of your gratitude. Help them to know of your abiding gratitude for their willingness to say yes and to serve you in this time. We ask you to be with us as we go into the rest of our evening. Help us to put down all those things which should not get done today and know that tomorrow is a new day. Let us live that new day with the power and the glow of the resurrection. All this we ask in your name. Amen.
Amen.
God bless you all. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to each one of you. Great to be with you. Have a good night.
Night.
Good night.
Thank you, Bishop Jeff.
Oh, thank you. Glad to do it.